slavery. He paid the price. He fought the battle. Go back to that one slide, little line before that, before this. Oh, I did put it in there. I guess what I'm talking about is that one little line. Being a slave of Christ is true freedom. Being a slave of Christ means true freedom. Now, when we talk about being a slave of Christ is true freedom, we're really talking about us being slaves of Christ. As I was talking to the kids this morning, I was trying to help them see that as we have Christ as our master, Christ as our leader, Christ as our guide, Christ is the one who focuses our life. See, that kind of language is really foreign to us Americans because we're all about freedom and individual choice and voting and I get a say in my rights. But did you know that as a Christian, when you allow Christ to take over your heart and life, you have in essence crucified your life and given it over to God. And so all the rights and privileges as of an individual, you have surrendered to Him to be a child of God. But now that you're a child of God, you can live in true freedom because the Holy Spirit brings freedom about in our lives. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But the concept here of, back now to our text, we have this slavery element in the Old Testament, and it permeates throughout the Old Testament because slaves were a big issue in those days. They were a main part of the economy. And so owning a Hebrew slave as a servant. Wednesday night we were talking about this, and in Philippians, in the NIV, it says, Paul and Timothy as servant of Christ. And the original Greek word there in Philippians is doulos. And doulos means slave in Greek. And so Paul was really saying, I'm a slave of Christ. And so in that context, we have this, wow, he's saying he's a slave. And we Americans, we just want to be paid servants. We want to get our money. We want to have our rights. We want to do our thing. But in essence, we're talking about total commitment to Christ and giving everything over to Him. So here are a group of people who have just recently been freed from slavery, and now God is speaking to them about owning slaves, which is kind of interesting. Very common for that time was the owning of slaves. They were acquired either by conquering an enemy or by purchasing them at a slave market. That was the normal process through owning a slave. God's law shows a tremendous difference between what owning a slave meant to a Hebrew and owning a slave meant to the rest of the world. God put some unique qualities to this relationship between master and slave. The difference being in how they are to be treated, and that there are limits and rules to ownership. For example, Leviticus 25:39 says, if one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave, because he's a brother. He's a fellow Israelite. He is a Hebrew. Deuteronomy 15:12 says, if a fellow Hebrew sells himself or herself to be your servant and serves you for 6 years, in the 7th year you must set the servant free. Just as in verse 21, or chapter 21 of Exodus. He's saying that it's a covenant relationship. In the Old Testament, the number 7 is incredibly important. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the 7th day He what? Rested. Do you know what the word Sabbath means? Doesn't mean Sunday. Doesn't mean Saturday. I used to think it meant 7. You know what it means? Rest. Stop. It means stop. Sabbath day means to stop, to rest, to cease working. And so in this Sabbath idea, you can own a slave for 7 years, but in the 7th year, you're to set him free so that the Sabbath would be honored. And so this concept of honoring this covenant, cyclic covenant relationship with God's people. When you read about the year of Jubilee, anybody know what that is? That's an interesting thing because that's 7 times 7 years, 49 years. And in the 50th year, you're to what? You're to rest. You're to forget all debts. You are to forgive all debts. In fact, let's say Bob Haskell buys my property, and in 30 years is the Jubilee. After 30 years, he gives me back the property. Let's say I'm in prison, and it's the year of Jubilee of 49th year of the cycle. In the 50th year, I'm set free. That's why when Jesus said, I have come to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, he was talking about the year of Jubilee. So when we get into this 7-year cycle in the Old Testament, 7 days, 7 years, seven years, there's a lot of connections with that. When we were doing our search through Revelation a couple of years ago, there was a lot of 7s in that, and it's following through with that same kind of idea. Number 2, the biblical rules in how to treat a slave. Set free after 6 years, to be treated as sons and daughters. And unless you're abusive to your kids, that means you treat them pretty good. If married, they get to take their wife and kids with them. If married while enslaved, they must leave their family or choose to stay forever, or go outside, work up the purchase price, and buy your wife and kids back from their master. Those are options that you have. The reason why I think in the mind of the Old Testament, what God was saying was that if you've been given your master children, in a sense, that they still belong to him. And as long as they own the wife, and she was something that you married. So as a slave, you would know that marrying your wife in slavery, marrying your girlfriend in slavery meant you would either end up staying to be that master's slave the rest of your life, or that when you got out, you'd have to work like a dog to get enough money to buy your family out of slavery. You following me so far? The slave can't choose to stay with the master for the rest of his life. Having his ear pierced with an awl shows that he is a lifetime servant. Then there's a female servant could do the same. The master must not release the slave empty-handed. Look at these 2 verses. This is Deuteronomy 15:13. When you release a male servant, do not send him away empty-handed. Give him a generous farewell gift from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Share with him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. So when your slave leaves in that 6th year, you're to send him not empty-handed. You're supposed to give him some sheep and some goats and some things to start his own business, his own farm. Number 3, God's purpose in allowing slavery in the Old Testament. Among the Israelites, a person could sell himself and his wife into slavery due to poverty or debt. Now, some of you think that would be the most horrendous thing to ever think about, to sell yourself or your wife. Maybe not so much your kids. You might want, in their teenage years, you might be willing to let them go. But, it's that idea of you could put your child in, and it's like it becomes like an indentured servant, someone who is working off a debt. So the master gives you money for your child or your wife or yourself for 6 years, to use you for 6 years. In the 7th year, you're set free. And that money then would go to pay off your debts and keep you from being imprisoned. So there comes a point where the idea of this slavery was a part of their economy simply because they didn't have banks in those days that made loans or credit cards or any of that kind of stuff. One of the reasons why we have a credit system in our country was to keep people out of indentured servitude or out of prison for being in debt. This is out of the Bible Knowledge Commentary, Old Testament. It says, among the Israelites, a person could sell himself or his wife into slavery due to poverty or debt, but the servitude was to be limited to 6 years. Thus, it was indentured service Further, a master was obligated to provide for his servant on his release. If a male servant wanted to remain in permanent servitude, his request was to be validated by the judges, and then one of his ears was to be pierced with an awl to symbolize the willing service. So the idea is that you're willingly choosing to be this person's servant the rest of your life. Now, some of us have done that in our jobs that we've chosen. Maybe the job you've chosen isn't necessarily one that you thought when you were a little kid you would grow up and be, you know. But maybe it's somewhere you have found a way to support your family and to pay the debts and things like that. And you are kind of stuck there until you're able to be independently wealthy. So there's that sense of, oh my goodness, I'm an indentured servant, you know. I'm a slave to the man, you know, that kind of thing. But reality is that all of us have made these kinds of choices in our lives. And perhaps because of the rules that God placed on slavery back in the Old Testament, it wasn't such a bad deal. For example, it might be smart for, you know, since they made arranged marriages in those days, it might be smart to have your daughter bought by a very wealthy man, knowing that she would be in a wealthy home and treated as a wife. And even as a daughter in that context, than it would be to marry someone on your same social status, which would mean that she would not be well taken care of. So there are different implications. We have a vantage point of early American slavery where people were beaten and chained and forced into labor, much different than what was in the Old Testament. Letter B. By the way, on your sermon, I happen to notice they're all letter A's for each point. So pretend the second letter A is a B and the third one's a C, okay? Just FYI. I did them fast on